Peter Hirschberg. Peter is going to be talking about maker cities.
I've just posed a problem, and I expect all of the makers to go build something around that. We have a fabulous panel today. I'd like to welcome up onto the stage Mayor Libby Schaaf from Oakland, Neil Hirschway, who is from the planning department in San Francisco, and Nick Pinkston, who is an entrepreneur well at work on what our cities might look like as manufacturing comes back. Let's have a seat, everybody. This is going to be a really fun panel because we're really looking at what happens as cities kind of once again become homes of making and industry, as industry comes back as smarter and as cleaner, and at a time when the issue of where do jobs come from and where does economic development come from becomes front and center. Last year at the White House Makers Fair, we had over 100 cities sign up for pledges to talk about how they might be maker cities. And what do we mean by that? We mean a focus on STEM education and STEAM education to bring people along, local manufacturing like SF Made, and actually citizen engagement with cities to co-create in cities, which are really kind of new and interesting developments. And the panel we have today is going to look at them from three directions. Neil has been leading a project in San Francisco that really asks citizens to co-design a part of town with them. When you think of urban design, historically it's been big architecture firms, big planning commissions, and maybe you all got consulted in a hearing. But what if the act of building a city was the act of prototyping with people? Well, that's a really interesting project that's going on. Nick has been doing really interesting work in advanced manufacturing that shows both how cities can be the homes of new companies and automated manufacturing, but also real implications for what kind of jobs do we need as manufacturing gets smarter and smarter. And Libby runs or is mayor of what might be as makery a city as we have in America. Oakland, a city that's steeped in a manufacturing tradition, has all of the creative traditions of today and is picking up and really learning how to exercise its oats, and at its core, really interesting policy problems that we're going to get into. I thought we'd start off with Neil, and to set the stage, I want to show you a little video. Just about a month ago, we had Market Street prototyping in San Francisco. The design problem is Market Street's going to be torn up, redesigned, relaid out, become more pedestrian-oriented. And how do you activate it? How would you take a part of town that isn't known for everybody going there and hanging out, and if you will, shocking it into being fascinating and drawing people out? And as we'll hear, the answer is not hire one architect, but have all of us work on it. So can we take a look at the first video from San Francisco? And there's some volume, please. That would be audio, as in background sound, as in like
give that sense of individual agency to the community and to the residents of San Francisco.
It's not traditional public art. It's not commissioned, juried, incubated deeply. It's not thought of in a permanent or even semi-permanent way. Prototyping is something different. It's process in public space. It's experimentation. And the prototypes that we've selected, I consider all of them to be artistic. You know, and what I'm after there is an expanded definition of what art is. I'd like to see a world where more people think of themselves as artists, and where artists are less marginalized and much more a part of the ongoing conversation and the ongoing fabric of their city.
So, Neil, what we're looking at here are across 2 miles of Market Street, close to 50 projects from a whole set of teams. And I gather you kind of changed the permitting rules in San Francisco for a short period of time to allow, in a way, makers to take over the city.
So the permitting side of it is sort of the background
you don't really see, but it was actually a major step forward in order for this more creative approach to city making to actually happen. And so we created a permit that actually really allowed, maybe we can go back to the beginning, I think that's like halfway through, a permitting process that actually just made Market Street a canvas for people, and it was a simple permit that we held the liability for most of the space, and really allowed people to focus on just their designs, their installations, their projects, and so it really opened up the space for them.
I mean, one thing you find is when you take maker and prototyping energy and you bring it up against a city, it rubs against traditions that don't generally pull for, like government's generally not about let's make a mistake and see what happens. Yeah. Let's throw a prototype out there. Yeah. Can we take his slides back to the very beginning? That's I think in the middle, so we want to go back to the first slide in the PDF, which we are zeroing in on.
There we go. Oh.
And excellent, Neil, take it away with Market Street prototyping.
All right, let me go see if I can, we're back to the last one. Let's see if I can get up to the first. There we go. So Market Street Prototyping Festival, it was a big idea that happened about a month ago. We had this concept of we needed to really rethink Market Street in a big way. And as you know, Market Street is our civic spine. And we had to catalyze, we had to sort of jumpstart some thinking, because right now it's a space that people move between spaces. And even though it's filled with 250,000 people every single day, it's not a whole lot of stuff happening, it's just a lot of movement. And so what we ended up doing was focusing on Market Street, and as Peter indicated, Market Street is being redesigned. It's a $400 million capital campaign in 2018. We're going to take the street from property line to property line, wipe it clean, redo the transportation, and redo the public spaces. And Market Street has always been our civic spine. This is 1945. When it was laid out in 1847 by Jasper O'Farrell, and if the stories were true, he was a slightly drunk Irishman who had some background in cartography, but he was the best option that the city had at the time. And so he had this grand vision for Market Street. And he took as precedent Market Street from Philadelphia, which at the time was the most celebrated city in America from an urban planning perspective. And it was laid out by this Frenchman, Henri Le Pen. And their Market Street was 100 feet wide. And he said, well, we can do better than that. We're better than Philly. And so he laid it out at 120 feet wide, which is an absurdly wide street for just about anywhere in America. And the one issue was that it went right through private property at 120 feet wide. And so when the property owners got wind that our future Market Street was going to be over their front doorsteps, literally, they formed a lynch mob, and they came after Jasper O'Farrell, and they chased him out of town. They couldn't catch him, thankfully. He made it to over the ferry to Sausalito, where he had some horses waiting, and he went up to his Sonoma ranch, where he hung out for the summer. And when he came back, cooler heads had prevailed, and we have this grand, memorable street of Market Street at 120 feet wide. And so doing the right thing for it is really important for the city, and I would argue for the Bay Area. And so just to give you a sense that this wasn't just an idea to, hey, how to bring 3-day activation to Market Street. This was actually tied to the capital campaign, because the ideas that were tested back in April are going to be brought forward as part of the capital campaign as we incubate them and iterate them and test them again in a few months and bring them back out. And eventually they will become the next iconic images of Market Street, and they will have come entirely from the maker, design, and artist communities, and not from some big architecture firms. So really inverting the model of actually how do we design our public spaces. And one of the things that was really special about what we were doing is just the scale of this. You know, there's been some amazing projects so far, you know, Up 2012 in San Francisco in the 5M project, and certainly lots of people have thought about how do you use Market Street as a stage. But I think what we did, we really sort of opened it up, and we did a couple special things. One, just the sheer size of it. You know, 300,000 people got to see and touch all these installations, which is just an incredible number over 3 days. We had over 200 submissions. People submitted 220 ideas, and we picked the best 55, and they're out there for 3 days. And you know, how do we get this idea? And it's not news to you. You know, you are here because you believe in the ideas of people with brilliance coming forth and designing, making, and testing and sharing those great ideas. And all we did was tap into that and say that we would be a better city if we could somehow capture that energy in a way that could really propel our city forward, and we had some really specific goals. And so I was at a conference with Peter, actually, and Carol Coletta from the Knight Foundation was speaking, and she was exactly talking about this, about the civic commons, about how we capture that. And then I realized we had a chance to actually bring in some new partners, and because how do you fund this stuff? How do you make it happen? It's great to have the idea, but making it happen. And Carol Coletta and the Knight Foundation were a really, really key part of that, and I'll talk about some of the other partners who actually also made it happen. But we set out, we are a public agency, we design streets, this is our mandate, and so what are the goals, and what are we trying to achieve through this festival? And the connection, community, and capacity were really big for us. One, San Francisco is going through a lot of tension right now. There's a lot of change, a lot of new people, a lot of people who've been there for a long time, and our public spaces have to be spaces where everyone can come together and have a moment of exchange, even if it's a very ephemeral thing, and a sense of empathy. And if our public spaces can't do that, our civic dialogues aren't going to get there either. And so we really feel strongly that our public spaces have to step up and be part of how we have that healing dialogue. The community, the ideas came from the community, they're judged by the community, they were evaluated by the community. This is really about government stepping out of the way and providing the canvas to the public and letting them tell us what should happen. And capacity, which is getting to the additional part of the partnership, is that there's no way that we could have delivered this festival, no combination of city agencies, without the help of the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and Deborah Cullinan, who heads it up, couldn't be here today. But she and I were perfect partners, to the point where we were sharing staff back and forth. And so that capacity building, the realization that we're not going to solve the pressing urban challenges that we have in our cities today, whether it's the public spaces, the activation, the attention, or even the things like climate change, unless we bring in new partners and have an honest conversation about what truly are the best ideas for us to move forward with. Some people are interested in, what do we ask people to respond to? And so these are sort of the 9 goals that we set out for people, like, hey, think broadly about these things as you start thinking about your designs and what would work on Market Street. And the things that sort of really resonate with people, the play, I'll come back to that. It's amazing how playful people really became with their ideas. The partnership I spoke about just briefly there. So this was a partnership, it wasn't just government coming in and designing a street. We partnered with YBCA. We had funding from the philanthropic community through Knight, and also the private sector really stepped up, and we had a lot of civic leaders all across San Francisco, from whether it's Wells Fargo or Autodesk, our own Department of the Environment, Twitter, Verizon. They all stepped up in a big way, and not just provided financial support, but actually really leaned in and helped connect us with their own communities. And I think that's what's a really special part about what we did. It was actually all these sectors coming together, and that was one of the new things that we were prototyping through this festival. So delivering the designs, you guys are experts. You know how to do this. This is your passion. These are your passion projects. And we had some teams who were really from the maker community and could provide leadership to the other teams. We had a lot of people who had no idea. They had never built anything in their life. They didn't know how to operate a saw. They didn't know how to do designs. They didn't know how to, source the materials. And so we created this system for people to really nurture each other. And so the design teams you have there at the top, on the bottom right is what we call the design captains. And these are sort of your professors and the people who'd been there before, who could provide that technical expertise and really mentor you through your design process. And then the community cohort, similarly, are the community leaders that to make sure that these prototypes, these ideas, weren't dropped in from 15,000 feet onto a community, and which would really be replicating the same sins of government telling you what should happen on your streets. And so the community cohort was that sort of checks and balance to make sure that these prototypes were really being responsive to the communities in which they were going to be placed. And of course, community engagement was a huge part of what we did. And so we tried so many different things. In government, we sort of sit back and we do these community workshops, and we call that a day, and we sort of check the box, like, oh yeah, we talked to the community, and it's the same 50 people who come out to every single workshop. And that's not community engagement. And we knew that we had to do a lot better than that if we were going to be successful in transforming Market Street. And so we had almost a dozen different things that we tried out, and we learned a lot about how to engage the community much more deeply in the spaces that matter and move them most. The festival itself. Just so background, Market Street's over 2 miles long, and so we made the choice strategically to put out 50, but we put them into 5 districts, so 10 to 11 each per district. And you can see where they're highlighted there in the yellow, and so it's like 1 block long. So there was some distance between the districts. It was a strategic choice. I think that actually pulling them together and concentrating them ended up being a great idea. Some of the big takeaways, what did we see when we were out there? I had no idea how many kids were on Market Street. The first couple days, it was a Thursday, Friday, and maybe we drew some people down who had heard about it and were just coming down and check it out. But I think a lot of we were just capturing people. We invited them to take a pause. And there were kids everywhere in every single block, and they were having fun. And it really opened our eyes to the sense that our streets can be public spaces, that these can be places where it can be playful and families are invited and have fun, where adults can have fun. And we talk about the liability. There were many, many moments I walked down the street and I'm like, oh my God, we're gonna get sued so badly. Luckily, nothing happened. And because a lot of these things they were fun. They were like, and a little bit crazy, and you saw kids climbing, and actually, Peter doesn't know, but that was actually my son climbing up that wall there. And it was high. It was probably above a certain height limit that it shouldn't have been. But people love to climb. They love to have fun. This was a 6-sided ping pong table that had like a 1980s arcade voiceover sound and lights, and it was like, red team 1, green team 3, and they play like AC/DC music and stuff like that. It was by far and away the biggest crowd pleaser. Ping pong is an insanely popular thing, popular game that just completely transcends age, background, gender, and we had more fun with that. And then people really took to heart this concept of connection, that in order to play, you couldn't play by yourself. I don't think there's anything out there that allowed you to play by yourself. This was a case here where you can see the knees sitting there and the kids walking past. If you had only one or the other, the water wouldn't work, but as you pair it up and you sort of walk, one person sat and one person walked, these shoots of water would come up, the sprays of water. And this was done by a group of grad students from Stanford who really believed that our spaces should be a place that we can come together and have that moment of connection. That'd be a really important thing. And that really happened during the festival. Lessons learned, I'll just get through the last couple slides here. And that, again, I can't emphasize enough that the partnership is absolutely key to making this stuff happen. We cannot lift this by ourselves as a city government. There's just no way that we have the knowledge, expertise, the connection, or the legitimacy with the public in order to do this. And so between YBCA and the Knight Foundation, this was a true partnership in city governance. And playfulness, I think the big lesson is that I went through urban design school, and you learn, you put a tree, and you pick the nice paving, and you put in a bench that looks like a bench, and you provide this canvas, this landscape for people to play in, and magically things will happen. And as it turns out, and I think this is a lesson you know very well, that's not how people work. You don't walk into a blank canvas and just sort of have fun with it, especially with these really boring materials. And so what if our public spaces need things like this? Maybe this is what true landscape architecture and urban design and city planning looks like, is installations like this. How would we reconceive the planning of our cities if this is actually what people desire? And so I think that's one of the big realizations we have moving forward, is actually how to make this part of our everyday work and bring in a lot of ideas, because again, there's no one person that has the genius to do all this by themselves. And then this culture shift. Peter alluded to Market Street and the culture of Market Street. It is pretty bereft of life, and people usually think of it as a dirty, scary place along many blocks. And even in the roughest part down in Central Market Street, I think that was our biggest success. We had huge crowds of people spending time all through the day and the night. We played opera on Friday night, and the place just went silent. It was packed with people, and this woman was singing opera, and it was the most gorgeous thing you could possibly hear, and you would never expect to have heard it in Central Market. And so we were transforming the culture of the space through practice. And so what are we doing? We're going to come back. We're going to have a festival next year to generate a whole bunch of new ideas. Over the next 12 months, we're going to take as many of those ideas as we possibly can, incubate, iterate with them, and so they can come out as semi-permanent installations, and they can spend the next year or two out in Market Street as we continue to learn. And we're gearing up towards 2018 and the big capital redo of Market Street. And so the things you saw last month, there's going to be a direct line between those and what you experienced in Market Street in 3 years.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This is kind of as makery the creation of a city as you, or co-creation as you can imagine. And if you think back 10 years when social media started and the bloggers showed up, editors looked at bloggers and thought, who the hell are these people? We're the editors, you're not official. And of course now you can't make news without working in social media or do brands without social media. And this is beginning to happen with architecture and cities. And architects and city planners, like editors, generally when you say, hey, great idea, the crowd's going to help you build the city, they shriek. And what you're learning is, in fact, when you create a process like this, it gets smarter, better, and people are more engaged.
Yeah.
So it's a great example. We'll come back more in questions in a moment. Nick, you're kind of one of the great citizens of San Francisco at work on kind of what does maker manufacturing look like, and also once we have new forms of technology in place, that implies a lot about our society. So now let's take a look and think through what happens when it gets makerized.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of interesting. When I moved to San Francisco like 4 years ago, I came here and I was like, hey, there should be there should be some local makers here. Of course, this is like the capital of making or something in the Bay Area. But I thought there would be more on like the hardware startups, where I'm sort of a mixture of makers and that. And one of the first things I ended up doing was I didn't find this, so I made one, the SF Hardware Startup Meetup, and then it was just like this nascent thing that came up from everywhere. Now there's ones in like every major place in the Bay Area, and now mostly, I don't know, all of North America and Europe at least. So I mean, it's been kind of this crazy thing that in cities we've seen these locuses appearing of the maker world everywhere, and of course the hacker spaces and everything as well. Thanks for the intro, Peter. So hey guys, I'm Nick Pinkston. So I'm the founder of a company called Plethora, and essentially like we are in San Francisco, and we have what I would say is the fastest way of going from a file, like something 3D that you have in your computer, to a part in your hand. We want to make that as fast as like ordering a pizza. And so to do that, it's lots of math and automation essentially. And then I'll show you what sort of the implications of like this and a lot of other things are for for our cities and sort of what making looks like in the future. So this is the software we made right here. So inside of SolidWorks, which is like a sort of normal design package, we have a plugin for that. And so normally when you would build something, you would call up a company and you would talk to an old guy on the phone usually, and you would ask, hey, what's wrong with my design? How much does it cost? This kind of thing. We basically have turned that guy's head into a piece of software that will highlight. You can see the red highlights on that. It'll tell you what is wrong in your design, how much it'll cost, everything in real time. You hit a button, and then all that information comes to our factory. And so we essentially have a factory that you can just throw this information into, and without any human involvement, our computers and robots just make it for you. And we can go from a CAD file to a part in like an hour, and there's no, like all the things, the programs automatically generate and everything. So we think that the future of manufacturing, at least in the general commodity kind of manufacturing, looks a lot more like cloud servers do today. So on the left we have an actual server, and you pretty much sit these in a warehouse somewhere and you don't think about them until they break. Machine tools are not that way. A lot of people are still required even in mass production to keep them going. But at my company, what our philosophy is like, don't touch the machine. Like just have like pre-simulate everything, have everything pre-computed, and then have the machine monitored, and then treat it like a server. And so when we make manufacturing, the reason it can be so fast is normally it would take like at least a day for a trained engineer to do that, which is very expensive and slow. And the reason it can be an hour is because we basically wrote a compiler in the software sense for manufacturing architecture. So that's the kind of factory we've built that makes that service, so quick. So that's a little bit about my background, which will color the rest of this. So I wanted to go into sort of like how in cities we can make, and what the sort of infrastructures there are to make, all the way from like grassroots makers, like all of us here are, all the way up to like companies, like big corporations that employ a lot of people in manufacturing. Sort of like, Detroit has makers on the ground, they've got them in, the River Rouge plant making, F-150s. It's like the entire thing. We need a diversity of company sizes and people if we're going to have like a diverse economy. So sort of the first thing is manufacturing is really complex. A lot of people think that that 3D printing is like this Deus Ex Machina, and it's like, okay, boom, 3D printing, manufacturing solved. It is not the case. Manufacturing is actually getting more complex over time because every little engineering problem, we've had another process to solve it. This is just steel. This used to be just a blacksmith, right, like 200 years ago. Now it's this incredibly complicated infrastructure that, no one city has all this stuff. But now it lets us build everything. So this is pretty crazy. When I think about components, so there's many different, very high richness in manufacturing processes, but really there's only three kind of things. You have kind of off-the-shelf stuff, bolts and nuts and whatnot that are just kind of standard components. You've got custom stuff, so things that, like in the case of us, we CNC mill a lot of metal, custom stuff that doesn't exist. And then you got these kind of secret sauce parts. So for instance, I use a microscope because we actually manufacture a microscope for this kind of high-tech startup company, and it's like a regular microscope, except the lens actually cuts. And so it's cutting the sample as it's filming it. It's actually getting 3D models of it. So, no one made a cutting diamond blade lens before, so they had to talk to a company, whereas the off-the-shelf parts, that's just like Amazon can do that. Custom, you can do it through us or through any other job shops, you can do that. But that's kind of the three kinds of parts. So I want to look at how that infrastructure plays out. So this is custom parts. So there's sort of scale of manufacturing all the way from the desktop manufacturing that is like mainly on display here, all the way up to like mass production. And you can look at things like in desktop is like kind of the most affordable. Of course, your landlord will not find out if you have this, if you're doing it right. And you can actually afford this thing. And it's the highest flexibility too, because you are the full controller of it. You can buy your own materials. If you want to like find a piece of wood off the ground and etch something into it, you can do that. The issue is it can't do everything. You can't cut stainless steel in this thing, most likely. You can't go very fast. So maybe you'll go to Tech Shop, and then Tech Shop has like the level up from those tools, so then you can still be the guy doing it, but it's expensive equipment you could never have in your home. Even if you had the money to buy this thing, your landlord would not let you put it in there. So now this is another way. So we need places like Tech Shop. I think of them as sort of like the modern libraries of a city, where we need to have this public resource so everyone has access to the means of production. Now, when you want to move from Tech Shop, you're producing thousands of units or something, maybe you'll go to another local company, like a job shop. So at a job shop, there, you go to them, you give them your files, so that's what my company is a kind of job shop. And, then they produce the files. There's still a guy in front of the machines. And then kind of from there, you've got mass production. So this is actually robots in front of the machines, and you pretty much pre-program them things and just let them keep going. And, having this whole thing allows a company to go from like one person or a couple people who are making something in their garage, and then Tech Shop, and then job shops, and then you can scale in a city, and then you can actually have companies that right where you are located can exist, hire people and everything else. So the economy gets much richer if you can have this all in one place. So I think this is very essential infrastructure we need to maintain. So, for instance, like we have one of the few, we're in San Francisco proper, one of the few shops that actually manufactures precision components in San Francisco because everyone's getting priced out. But the issue is we're so close, we're really close with all the engineers who design everything in San Francisco, So all the different startups and R&D companies come to us because we're so close. Oh, it's a really big thing. You don't want to lose that. Like you, in many ways, almost want to subsidize the job shops or something so they can stay, so your economy is really dynamic instead of like having to go elsewhere. Because if you had to drive more than a couple hours, then it's like, well, you might as well just go to China or something, right? It's like really hard. And speaking of China, so another thing, so if we got sort of custom stuff, we also have off-the-shelf stuff. So a big part of this, so if you make electronics, there's like millions of little components you might want. Radio Shack, if it existed, does not have that stuff. We do not have these things in the United States. You got to order it, so it takes a couple days to do it, Now, if this is a place called Huaqiangbei, and in Shenzhen, China, which is like the capital of making electronics, I think like 80% of the world's electronics come from like this one province in China. I've been to these electrical markets, and they're totally insane. Like it's like malls in America, except instead of I don't know, Forever 21 or something, you go in and it's like, hey, this is the stepper motor store. And then you can buy motors by like the 100 there, or if you want to buy the 100,000, they got a factory in the outskirts of the city, and they can do it. They're unparalleled in doing this because they've maintained that infrastructure there that has all the supply base, guys who can do prototyping all the way up to mass manufacturing like Foxconn exist there. So that's why it's such a thriving thing. So it's like, I think this is in many ways a model of how we can do it. Not that everyone needs to be a Shenzhen, but I think we need these components locally, not just in like DigiKey or something, which is great. It's just, but we need speed. The economy is powered by speed. You can make something in Shenzhen in like a day that would take you a week here. And we can't do that. We cannot be competitive that way. So that's like making in a city. Now I'm going to flip that on its head. How do we make cities from a sort of infrastructural perspective? I saw this article recently about, okay, you can't come to Maker Faire and talk about making cities without tiny houses, I feel like, because it's just like the grassroots thing. I'm not sure this is super scalable in cities, but it's an interesting thing. And it's one thing where you can grassroots build your own house. So this is one way we can do it. A little bit further, back to China again, there's this company called the Broad Sustainable building company, and they actually have this like Lego model where they build everything and then assemble it on site. They're actually trying to make, I think, like a 50-story tower in like 15 days. Some like ridiculous thing like that. And they build them in factories. So this is just a small little piece of their factory. And they build these Legos and they just build them prefab. And you know, it's a kind of crazy thing to think about. Like in America, I feel like we used to do this. Like I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I remember going to the blast furnaces. You know, they're dead now, but you know, going to what they had. And I asked the guide who was with me, and I was like, you know, how long did it take them to build these? He was like, 4 months. I was like, 4 months? We can't like get a house built in 4 months now. It's crazy, but like I think that over in China, it's not like that. It's like, incredible how fast things move there, and I think this is one of the things like it. But we also have our own version in New York of this too, where they're actually building them in pods and doing it. So we can definitely do it here. But I think it's an interesting way of building cities. And then there's some super utopian stuff that's around like 3D printing buildings and everything, or just automated construction. I'm not sure I'm totally in with the 3D printing buildings. Seems slower than just cutting it robotically. But you know, that's another way people have thought of doing it. A big limitation here though is actually building design itself. Building design is still something where in the end 2D blueprints come out, and then you've got like these sheets of 4x8s, and you're cutting with a ruler and a pencil. Like that's kind of old school. I think we're going to go well beyond that. And one of the things is actually getting software that lets, to me, I would love to be, I'm not an architect at all. Maybe you're the architect. But you know, when I look at this, I think like I wish people could just design their own buildings. And in the same way, like so our software, you know, this is where I'm coming from. Plethora software like looks at the parts and says, hey, what's going wrong? There actually are softwares now that look at your building in the 3D design and tell you if you're compliant to building code. Like that's pretty crazy. Like we're actually maybe at a point where we can design our own buildings, inspect if they're actually in code. Maybe the city can even have this thing and like, okay, run it on your files. Brr, okay, cool, you're in compliance, build it, you know? That's, yeah, maybe we can do that soon, maybe. But this is actually possible from a technical point of view. I think it's mostly a policy thing why we can't do it, but probably like 10 years it'll be technically implementable. So that's making cities. Now, making society, I think I have sort of a front row seat to the industrial employment issue because I actually employ people in our factory. And it's not just all engineers. There are people that work on the floor and maintain things and everything. So these are some of the things that I saw. So we have no trained machinists at Plethora. There are no people who are apprentices and went up. We actually take people off the street who just have good attitudes and want to learn. And then we have a training program in a month that brings these guys up to speed. And the reason we can do that is we built interfaces for all the equipment that make it really easy to do. So the creativity in machining, for instance, what we do is in like how you actually do all the cutting paths and the holding and everything. There's a lot of different stuff. All that is done on the computer. So essentially, like the computer has taken what was the creative job, and then it does it automatically. So it would take a machinist a day. It takes us about a minute of compute time. So it's like a really asymmetric. It's impossible to compete against that. So what happens is that we've wanted to think like, how can we make good jobs for people, and then how can we get people in our factory floor workforce, and how do we give them a path? So they're not, a guy asked me when he first joined, he's like, hey, if we're automating all this, where's my job? And it's like, well, this is what we have to work on, right? What we think of in our company is like, we automate one process, and those guys are actually done, not just, okay, here's, put the brick into the plate. No, it's not like that. We actually bring them in, and yeah, they are just loading drill bits and stuff at first, but after that, we teach them how to do 3D software, we teach them how to do like the machine operation, we send them to maintenance school, all this kind of stuff, and we have this kind of, I think of it like a conveyor belt. Like we bring people in, they're super, noobs, and then we keep getting them trained up and inspired, and pretty soon they're actually like helping our engineers build the robots that we make and everything else. So it's a way of bringing people into this that wouldn't have training, because you can't. The vocational training is not super handy in the it's kind of too basic and not specialized enough. And because we're such a specialized company, no one trains people on how to operate an automated machine shop. It just doesn't exist. So I think the training for flexibility is a big thing that is a problem. I remember speaking at a vocational school thing, and everyone afterwards was like, what kind of curriculum do we need? What kind of skills? And it's like really not any one skill. It's like the ability to learn is really the big thing, but it's hard to teach. And another thing we find is the guys who repair our machines, they're in school like 20 or 30% of the time. So it's like they are constantly keeping up with what's the newest and latest and greatest thing. So if you're a technician, you are a very rare commodity, actually. They're paid very well because they're just constantly schooling. And I think that it's weird because the regular education system can't even keep up with this. It has to be private companies rolling their own schools to actually do that, which has been interesting. As this economy, this is to increase specialization, as the economy increases in richness and complexity, you get these weird super niche businesses. Like I know a friend who, they just make ultra precision balls. They're like 1/1,000,000th of an inch precision balls, and that's the entire company. And it's like something like that wouldn't have existed 100 years ago, right? But now, like the niches that we have make it so that there's all these very specialized jobs that we can exist. And that's like, okay, maybe jobs are going away in the basic, like loading the machine jobs, but these higher skilled jobs that are in very specialized things are actually coming up because that's what we produce. So who knows if we're actually going to go for better or for worse on the automation thing. Let's figure it out. This is just some potpourri of like interesting automation stuff that has some political ramifications. There is actually a company, and there's many companies, but this one has done a pretty good job. It's called Software, W-E-A-R. And they have an automatic sewing machine that can automatically do, soft goods, which is like, the thing in robotics is super challenging. Like machining what we do, super easy compared to this. But I wonder, like, okay, if we're actually going to automate sewing, what happens to, a lot of developing countries, the first export markets they have are making clothing. What do they do when this is now roboticized? The first spare income they have, that definitely concerns me. So I'm wondering, like, what's going to happen with that? Also, I'm talking about actually having the technicians that we have is, everyone says, okay, we're going to lose the job loading, but the guy doing the technician work, that's still going to be around. I'm not so sure. Like, we're actually seeing design for robotic, like, maintenance. So the robots actually will maintain your machines, too. So I'm not sure that's true. Like, so some weird, future ramifications. Like, so this is actually, going away from technology, I think the social implications of this are interesting. Has anyone ever heard of Mondragon before? Anyone? A couple people. I think this is like the biggest untold story ever. So Mondragon, it's this co-op. They have 74,000 people in Spain. Spain has 20-some% unemployment. They have 7% unemployment. So they've done this amazing thing. And what they do is, it's in Basque Spain, outside of Bilbao. And I've visited here before, and it's incredible. This is their little whole campus. And their model is actually that not only does everyone own a piece of the company, but they have their own university. They have their own social safety nets. They have their own healthcare system and unemployment. So they have all this stuff. It's very all-inclusive. And even if a business fails, all their people then get unemployment, and they're relocated to other co-ops in this thing. So they've made this since the 1950s as a way of having a more sustainable manufacturing model. They make a ton of stuff. I know them because they make machine tools. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. No one knows about it. But I think Mondragon might be a model for us in the future of how we can actually have a society where workers can share in the benefits of production while these companies are still allowed to fail because some of them won't be efficient. Companies should be allowed to fail, but we need to make sure the workers are taken care of. Mondragon does a good job of that. So they would call themselves, if we call ourselves maybe capitalists in America, and then there's socialism, they would call themselves distributist because everyone is distributed a piece of shares in their company. So interesting model there for industrial production organization. Of course, Burning Man is another kind of city that you build that has its own culture, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to be learned from kind of prototyping a city every year for this. I'm sure plenty of people in the audience have been here. There's also this even wilder idea. There's an economist, Paul Romer, has this idea that we should go to countries that basically have issues in developing because they have bad law, whatever, and then make a new city. So I know Honduras was trying to do this, and Madagascar was trying to do this, and they actually would carve out a couple hundred square kilometers to make new cities. So people are even thinking of making cities from whole cloth, which is totally nuts, but that is the thing people do now. And then in the crazy side, maybe you guys know locally, the Steestedding guys, they actually want to make floating platform cities to have people out there to get out of laws or something like this. So super utopian. But yeah, so this is like taking the nth of city building of both culture and infrastructure there. So I guess I'll sort of leave it at that and say I think that, you know, manufacturing as it interacts with cities is like long history. I mean, cities in many ways existed because of manufacturing, because we had to get all these people together, you know? And so as we develop, I think that manufacturing plays a really big part in how companies are made, how people are employed, and everything else. So I guess, Peter, I'll give it back to you.
Well, you've certainly done a good job of putting on the table the implication of all this. We live at this really interesting moment where we're kind of at the end of 50 years of amazing automation and work in IT, and we see this showing up in the automation of jobs and all of the intelligence that's in the stuff that Nick, you've talked about. And now we're moving into a world where we not only can bring manufacturing back into cities, but in fact what manufacturing is and who's involved and what's the nature of work comes on the table really quickly and more soon than we might expect or be comfortable with, and it starts to raise fundamental questions like how would you run capitalism and how do you solve all these things? And you know, normally these would be things that would be far off, but they're coming up quickly. Well, Mayor, there certainly is an interesting time to be a city that sits in the middle of making, that has kind of a great deal of talent here and in a way is remaking itself at once with a whole bunch of challenges, but really at a moment when kind of making has come onto the agenda, and here's Oakland with it. So, you know, when Mayor Schaaf also, I was asking her, how did you become the mayor who had such making context? And you have a background in working in a number of the arts organizations in Oakland and Burning Man, so you kind of have a sense for all of this stuff. By the way, at the White House the other day when we were getting ready to talk about the 100 cities that will be part of the Mayor's Maker Challenge this year, Burning Man is one of them. It's part of the club. But also, you rode to your inauguration on an art car.
I did.
So talk to us a little bit about Oakland as Maker City and the challenges you have from a policy point of view of pulling this stuff along.
All right, I'm going to stand up just so
Great.
people in the back row can see. I wanted to talk about two things. One, why Oakland is such an amazing maker city, but also what each of you could do if you're a maker. What type of advocacy should you be doing in your cities to make your cities more maker friendly? First of all, I was really honored to be asked to be here. I am not a maker. You can ask my husband. I have not even made dinner since I became the mayor. But I am so proud to be born and raised in Oakland. And as the mayor of Oakland, I know that for my city to become great, to really own its greatness, it needs to be itself well. It cannot mimic or try and imitate some other city that you two might live in. And we don't need to, because Oakland has this amazing legacy. You talked about secret sauce and showed, I think, a microscope lens. But I love talking about the secret sauce of Oakland kind of as its culture, like what makes it unique. And for Oakland, that's our diversity, our artists. We have always had an amazing creative energy in our city. We have always had this kind of gritty industrial flavor. We've always had, people that make things, whether it's been, old school manufacturing or the more contemporary version of makers. And then finally, we are a city of progressive values. We start social movements. We even love to protest. That is Oakland. So that is part of why I think that legacy has been so friendly to the maker movement. Now, I don't usually admit in public that I've been to Burning Man because, not every audience thinks that that's cool for a politician to have gone. But it is true that in Oakland, that actually does earn you points. So what makes Oakland so good? You talked a lot about physical stuff, but I really do think that there is an intangible creative energy. That when you have a critical mass of people that are doing interesting stuff, it builds on itself, and that is the energy that creates a great space and great atmosphere for the city to be pushed along. It is true that bureaucracies are not necessarily made to accommodate this new world. And it's part of why I love, and it was not a plan that the mayor's official car was an art car that is in the shape of a snail that breathes fire. But I've really claimed that as a symbol, and actually I've started internally a little, we call it the Flaming Snail Award. And I give it out to city workers who I catch going above and beyond the call of duty and who are thinking outside the box. Because, the snail is a great kind of symbol for what people think of when they think of bureaucrats, right? Slow-moving, slimy things. But this snail is turbocharged and it breathes fire. It's like it's not your daddy's bureaucracy. And so that is why I think that in Oakland we're trying to take the culture that our residents bring, that creativity, that ingenuity, that thinking outside the box, that prototyping, that not being afraid to fail. Because government is not good at risk-taking. We don't generally get rewarded for it. You, who give us your taxes, generally don't like us to gamble with them. And so it's hard, but we do need to push the organization along in government. So how is Oakland doing some things that you could bring back to your own cities? Well, first of all, do get your mayors to ride art cars. I think that is a good way to lift up the maker movement. But seriously, when you look at economic development, you have to think about giving value to things like makerspaces. And I know you decided we didn't have time to show a little film about...
We can still show it, but I wanted to get you started to make sure that we had time.
All right, American Steel Studios. A lot of the stuff that is here today was made at American Steel Studios. Did anybody see the Megabot doing the paintballs at the art car. That was made in Oakland at American Steel Studios. It's also where I had my inaugural festival as a way of, again, highlighting and bringing new people into a maker space. So that space has been actively marketed for a Costco. Can you imagine a greater tragedy than the American Steel Studios becoming a Costco? And to recognize that when you evaluate what makes your city valuable, it is not only the taxes that are going to be generated by a new development. It does have to do with sometimes an intangible quality that your city can brag about.
As mayor, how do you, so here is real estate interests that want to take something, and because they know the economics of Costco or a condo, and you as mayor understanding this is the nature and the character of your city. People come to Oakland for that kind of stuff. How do you then, from a policy point of view, drive that stuff through and bring traditional real estate and traditional finance along to understand that if you get rid of that, it's no longer Oakland and it may hurt?
There are a couple ways. There's the carrot and there's the stick. On the carrot side, Oakland has done what's called area-specific plans, where we have sometimes done some rezoning and we've done the environmental clearance work to encourage certain types of development. We're also trying to make the permitting process a lot more friendly for maker spaces. And then recently, we even did an RFP for a beautiful building in Oakland that we're offering. It's a public-private partnership. And right now, we're recommending as the new use for this space, a maker space. So we're promoting it ourselves. The stick part is to, kind of shame people. I've threatened that I will, lie in front of the bulldozer if it gets sold for a Costco. But at the end of the day, this is privately owned property, and so government can only do so much to help or hurt a decision that a private property maker makes.
I think one of the reasons that it's terrific that we actually, this term of art, Maker City, I think we used it a year ago for the first time at the Makers Fair, but the fact that it exists means that you can draw threads between Oakland and Pittsburgh and other cities on the same mission and show it's valuable. I was in Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago, and Mayor Puto convened a meeting of a whole bunch of people, largely to convince the private real estate owners not to put the Costcos and the condos in, because it would stop being Pittsburgh that, like Oakland, has this industrial tradition. And the fact that we can all be united behind this thing with the name, with all of you, and a pretty large move behind it, I think is part of the point.
Well, and the next thing we're doing, we've just put together a special task force around affordability. And when, one of the things that's happened is San Francisco has gotten so damn expensive that your people are coming to move to my city because it's so affordable in comparison, but it is threatening to push my people out of my city. And so we are really trying to be proactive, particularly for our artists, our makers, and not just where they live, but also where they work. I think sometimes that gets lost in the affordability discussion. You don't want to just preserve residences, but also those small businesses. I want to just throw out one other cool thing that we're doing in Oakland, because makers, when they have an idea, but they want to actually start to capitalize it, it can be hard to get capital to take that idea and start to make it into a company. We have partnered with Kiva Zip. Has anybody here ever made a loan on Kiva to like a developing country? Well, Kiva Zip is the domestic version of that. So you can, we crowdsource these small loans up to $5,000 at 0 interest. And it's a great way for a lot of our makers to kind of get their very first loan, because the process for getting approved is very simple. It's not a traditional commercial loan.
I've got a workforce development question. In San Francisco and in Oakland, this whole question of training and bringing people along, bringing up to speed is vital, but you put on the table that where we aim our workforce is really important, because we may be coming by with automation and where we need to have people end up maybe look different than today. What advice would you share with these two great cities here that you've learned kind of at the leading edge of how you skill people up? And then I'm interested in kind of what we're both doing.
So the question is like, how do we skill people up?
Well, I mean, you're suggesting that the skills we need to give people may not be the traditional manufacturing skills because we may automate them. So, and here are two cities hard at work at trying to train the next generation. So what advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the education is a massively huge thing. It's just not focused in the right areas. And it's not the right, I think the main thing is that the jobs programs typically are like, you're going to go to be a welder, and there's a certification, and there's a union, and then you get a job. It's like, very definite path. The issue is that processes that are developed, at least in our kind of company, where it's like the highest innovation, they don't exist yet. You can't teach them, So I mean, I think the flexibility is probably the main thing. And even like, not even like really technical skills. I think that like actually skills that are more about like just like being able to manage people and being like a good foreman, being able to like hire people, like actually the skills that are more like people skills are actually very useful. And actually just being able to show up on time and organize things. Like honestly, like it's easy to bandsaw aluminum a bunch of times or load drill bits or whatever, but it's really hard, I think, to actually manage people and everything else. So I think that we focus a lot on technical education. I'll do that at our company because no one else can. I want people who are just good at learning.
This points out why kind of maker-based education for young people, where you understand a whole project and how to get things done with the team, is important. And you mentioned that's a big project of yours.
Yeah, I wanted to, because you were double mic'd. I want to give a shout out to Danny Beasley. Are you still here, Danny? Yeah, right there. Danny has helped create fab labs in a number of our high schools and community colleges. And there's a charter school in Oakland called Lighthouse Community Charter School that also is trying to infuse making in their entire K through 12 educational system. And it's because that process of having a problem, designing around the problem, and then physically making the solution to your problem is an amazing skill. It is completely transformable, transferable, and transformable. And I think that is what we need more of. And so there are some glimmers of hope. Laney College just opened their fab lab. Castlemont High School, which is in deep East Oakland, in a otherwise challenged part of our city. And this is kind of, the new version of SHOP.
Yeah, I'm not the education guy, but what I would say is what we did find through the Prototyping Festival is another type of learning, in that of re-engaging people in their city and believing in their city and realizing that the city is still pulling for them. And I think that attitudinal shift it's actually how you harness it, how you actually get people to sign up and say, I'm going to invest in making San Francisco or Oakland or any of these cities a better place because the city has given me a spot and has said my voice matters. And I think for too long we've had this sort of didactic relationship between government and the public and how decisions are made. And so I think it's fascinating the sort of the soft skills of what you need to be able to bring to an innovative and rapidly dynamic economy, but also from the civic side as well. There's a whole new set of skills that we have to sort of reintroduce and say that you are a citizen, and that comes with a certain sets of rights and responsibilities about participating, and we're going to work with you to make sure that you have the platform to exercise those rights and responsibilities.
This actually points out one of the things that I think San Francisco's done really well over the last few years. If you think about it, when we were in school, we might have had civics. And when you were taught civics, it's like, here's how a bill's introduced and becomes a law, and then everybody in the class went to sleep. But today, in many ways, when we have new forms of things like open data and participation, it becomes a verb. It's like if you're in middle school and you're telling the kids, go off and measure the water quality in your city, or go work with open data, you're inviting them to mess with the city and co-create with it. It's a project just like any other maker project out there. That's an invitation to the city. Yeah. And then you've extended that. Now the invitation is like, well, there's this part of town to design. And you even used an example when we were talking to me that you brought up. As you start thinking through what market streets look like, you once told me you think it needs to be more like a big Lego where we can change it around and move it as opposed to it's a 75-year structure.
Yeah. No, that's we're at a point in time where investing money and making something so precious that it's there for the next 75 years, I think is a huge waste of public money. And it is not responsive to the brilliant culture that is being expressed through organizations and movements like this. We're at a point in time where our public spaces should be evolving as rapidly as our culture is evolving, and as our economy is evolving. And so how you design a street, how you design a building, how you design a public space, how you program it has to fundamentally be, your conception of that has to change.
And government has to give up some of its power in this process
Yeah.
because government has been controlling the civic space for a long time. But your point about how fast we can make things and how they don't need to last for 100 years changes that equation. And so it really allows us to invite in the public. And you know, we need people to fall back in love with democracy because government cannot do it alone. We've got to engage the citizenry in a meaningful dialogue, and whether it's around the public space, whether it's about hacking our governmental data, which, gosh, in Oakland we have an amazing civic hacking group called Open Oakland that builds apps and, you know, visualizes our budget, and boy, they've done everything about campaign finance. You can find out everybody who gave me money when I ran for mayor. Their pie charts. That is inviting people in to really participate in democracy, kind of like what you said about, you know, the town hall meeting. We're done with that. We've moved on. Engagement needs to be much more creative, much more authentic, and much more coming to where people are to begin with.
And what's amazing is this is an urge that we in the cities world have learned from the software and the making world in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
We have time for a few questions, so we should open it up to the audience if anyone has questions here. And if you do, you can probably come to that microphone right there.
Yeah. Good seeing you again, Peter. So on the George Belmont front, so I see kind of a gap between previous generations, like old tool and die makers and pattern makers, and maybe they don't get the new digital stuff. But they've got an enormous amount of stored knowledge that if they could share it with the younger folks and come together in some kind of, you know, guildy kind of relationship, you know, it works real well. I mean, it's good teaching the young folks, but we're leaving these other folks out. So you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, this is actually something that I talk with a lot of the machine tool organizations about that specifically. So when I go to like IMTS, the sort of maker fair of the machine tool show, or the machine tool industry, you know, I was asking their educational guys like exactly on that point, like can we like get people who already have all the knowledge and get them, because I talk with a lot of hardware startups who are often like software guys who don't know anything about making things, and they need to talk to people, and you know, like it's expensive if you want to talk to some design company, but yeah, there's some tool and guy who actually know everything. Yeah, and a lot of those guys are retired and wanted to just talk to you.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
So I think those need to be programs. You know, I've wanted to start an event like that, but I don't know. I always run a lot of events, but I think you're right. I think it's a definite thing we should.
Yeah, they're
tap
not used to
into.
mentoring and crowd, you know, all the kind of social things that we do in the tech industry. So whatever we can
Totally.
do there would be to the good.
And you know, I agree with you, and I think that there's actually a space for some kind of like almost like Wikipedia of making or something like this. Like Wikipedia, if you look up like stamping or something from tool and die, it's like a process whereby metal is shaped. It's like not really useful for anything, you know? And I feel that like we actually no one even knows all these different processes. Like you look around the world, even most makers can't name more than a couple of manufacturing processes.
Yeah.
And so how are you gonna make stuff if you don't know?
Yeah, the knowledge resides in those people, so I think it's bringing people together is probably the key to it.
Totally.
Yeah.
We probably have time for another question or so.
I have a question.
Stuart.
Maybe stating the obvious, but has anybody thought of putting a market on Market Street?
So you know there is one. It's called the night market, and it's more of like a festival space in UN Plaza. I think one of the things that we were trying to do through the prototyping festival was really to bring non-commercial uses to public space and say that our public spaces should be public and open to everyone, and that there's no barriers to entry, there's no cost to entry, there's nothing you have to lay on the table in order to participate and engage with other people. And so I think there was a really conscious effort to make sure that the space remained truly public. And we had responses, you know, again, the Central Market area, you know, people who lived on the street, who were extremely poor, lived in subsidized housing, coming up and saying, thank you for doing this. No one does anything nice on our block ever. And it's usually filled with gangbangers and drug dealers, and it's really uncomfortable for me to spend any time out there. In the past 3 days, I've come out and played and met so many people. I've laughed, I've smiled, I've had a great time. And I wish it would like this all the time. And I think, you know, the cafe scene and the markets are really important strategies. It's a tool that we do use, and we're not going to lose them. But I think we've maybe perhaps gone too far down that path as sort of the sole way to activate public space. And we have to start being much more creative and have different types of partnerships to make sure that the public spaces are for truly the public.
This is a remarkable time for cities as people are moving back into cities. You know, when I was growing up, there was flight from cities and they were in disrepair. We have the opposite problem now. They're getting so popular, we have these issues of affordability, but at the same time, all this creativity, and it's up to all of us to architect that in a way that's open and responsive to the creativity and to the new industry that's coming into the city, so we literally get to make the maker city that's the one that we want to live in, and that's the work that's on the table. So thank you all so very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.